All right, welcome back everyone. Today we're going to talk about what we're going to call 5 number sets and box and whisker plots. These again are working with data, and they're ways that we can help analyze data that we may have in a set of information. As you can tell by the name of this, we're going to have 5 numbers that we're going to be working with. And this is going to help us to both analyze our data as well as create a box and whisker plot, which we're going to talk about towards the end of this video. The first 3 of those 5 numbers are things that you already know. You need to find the minimum value, which is the smallest amount, the median, which we talked about before as being the exact numerical middle of our data set, and finally, our maximum or our largest value. Then we're going to talk about some new things. We're going to talk about something called quartile 1, also sometimes said as first quartile, and quartile 3 or third quartile. One quick note here, if you're paying attention to some of the important vocabulary words, you're going to notice that that word quartile may remind you of the word quarter. And in fact, it's representative of both the fraction or our money value of quarter. So when we talk about this, you might be going, well, why is there only 1 quarter and 3 quarters? Well, there actually are 2 other quarters, and you just know them in different names. So the median is another way to describe quartile 2, and the maximum is another way to describe quartile 4. We'll talk about that a little bit more once we create our box and whisker plot. So we are going to use the same information that we used yesterday. This was our age of 6th grade students, and we're going to work through our process to see if we can find our 5 number set. The first things are probably the easiest ones to find. That's our minimum value and our maximum value. Well, you don't even really have to do any work to find that. You can pretty easily see that your minimum value is 10 and your maximum value was 12. After we've done that, the next thing you need to find is actually that median value, which we know how to do. We're simply going to walk through that same process of crossing off on both sides until we end up exactly in the middle. In this case, if you remember from yesterday, we ended up at 11. Finally, we're going to work on these new things called quartiles. Quartiles are actually very similar to median. The way you can think about it, it is quartile 1 is the median from the minimum value to the median of the whole set of data. So what I mean by that is we're going to start our crossing off step right by where our median was. So you're going to notice I started with the 11 that was right next to our median value, and then I crossed off on the left side the 10. Then I continue to find that median value the same way. I noticed that I had 2 numbers, and we talked about this yesterday as well. If I have 2 numbers, I need to find the mean of those 2 numbers. So 10 plus 11 was equal to 21. Over 2 was equal to 10.5. So I know my first quartile, or quartile 1, is equal to 10.5. I'm going to follow that exact same process to find quartile 3. I'm just going to do that on the right-hand side of my median instead of on the left-hand side. So let's go ahead and walk through that. You're going to notice I've crossed out the 11. Again, it was directly to the right of our median. And the 12, I ended up with 2 numbers and found the mean of those 2 numbers exactly as we described before. Now that we have our 5 number set, I'm going to take that over to a different page, and we're going to learn how to turn this into a box plot or a box and whisker plot. They're sometimes use those vocabulary terms interchangeably, box plots or box and whisker plots. And you're going to see why really quickly here. So I've drawn a number line. On that number line, I want to make sure I include my minimum value and my maximum value. So I started at 8 and went all the way to 13. That way I can see my minimum value of 10 and my maximum value of 12. Then my first step is going to be to place a dot at my minimum value. So right above the 10, I place a dot. Then I'm going to place a dot at my maximum value. So I should have 2 dots. One dot is going to be where the minimum value is, and 1 dot is going to be where the maximum value is. Next, I'm going to draw 3 lines. Those 3 lines are going to go at quartile 1, at the median, and at quartile 2. After I've done those 3 lines, I'm going to create a box, and this is where our term box plot comes from. Finally, I'm going to connect those dots for my minimum and my maximum value to that box, or these are called the whiskers. So I just draw a line out. You're going to notice that this whole data display is raised above my number line, and that just makes it really easy and clear to see where everything is. Sometimes it can get really hard to tell if you're overlaying that directly on top of a number line. So we're going to just raise that above just a little bit. Now, one of the things that's really helpful for us as we look at that box and whisker plot is we're going to look at each of these yellow circles that are going to come up. And each of these represent 1/4 of the data that was there. That means 1/4 of the numbers that we had fell between that minimum value of 10 and that quartile 1 value of 10.5. And that's going to be true for each of these 4 circles that we're going to show up. Each of these represent 1/4 of our total data that we have. Simply by looking at this, and I want to go back one quick second, simply by looking at this, you're going to be able to tell that our data is pretty even. And you can tell that because each of those quarter sections are just about the same length. The second thing, and this is what I was about to show you here, was that middle box represents 50% of our total data. And that tells us where did most of our data fall. Remember, we're talking about measures of central tendency, and this really helps us to see what does that middle part of our data look like. Now, in this particular case, we didn't have very many numbers in our data set, and it was really evenly distributed. So I'm not actually getting a whole lot of information from this box and whisker plot that we created. So we're going to do another example, and we're going to use some other numbers to hopefully tell and show us some things that are going on here. So let's go ahead and take a look at another set of data that we've got. Remember, my first suggestion to you is to always put your number in order. So I'm going to walk back through this process just to remind you, right, we want to cross out to make sure that we're not using any numbers twice or we're not missing any numbers. That's really important. But putting these numbers in order is always helpful. We did this with stem and leaf plots, and we did this with dot plots and histograms. It's a lot of times really easy to set up by putting these things in order first. After we've done that, we then need to find our minimum value and our maximum value and our median. That's pretty simple in this particular case. Let me go back real quickly. Our minimum value was 5 and our maximum value was 3. We can see that right on our data. And then I'll walk through that process to find our median value and all of that same stuff that we've talked about already. I ended up with 22 as my median value. So that means I'm going to really start where my median value is at to find that quartile 1. So remember, I'm going to follow that same process. One of the things I'm going to do here is I'm going to use different colors that might help me make sure that I'm not making any mistakes. So I found my quartile 1 and I found my quartile 3. Oops, I see a mistake down below. This should say quartile 3. Let me fix that. Because remember, our median value is quartile 2 there. And one last thing here, we're going to remember that we're starting that count from our median, right? So I'm not crossing off my median value. I'm starting from that median. That's kind of my end point. That might help you there. Now that I have my 5-number set, I'm going to go through the process to create a box and whisker plot. So let's walk through that process a little bit of how we actually create our box and whisker plot. Our first step is to have a number line. Again, I want to make sure I include my minimum value and my maximum value. So I've started at 0 and I go all the way up to 60 in this particular number line. And I've counted, in this case, every 2 lines represents 5. And I've done that simply because my range, the distance between my minimum and my maximum value, is just so big. And so I want to make sure I can fit all that on my page. Then we're going to just walk through that process. I'm going to put one dot above my minimum and my maximum value. So I have a dot at 5 and a dot that's approximately at 53. It's probably not in the perfect spot there. Then I'm going to create 3 lines. My first line goes at quartile 1. Goes at my median. My second line goes at quartile 1, and my third line goes at quartile 3, which is 36. Then I'm going to create a box around those 3 lines and finally connect my whiskers. What you're hopefully going to see in this data that was a little bit different than what we looked at on our last page, if we just refresh and think about that, is we end up with some things that are what we would call a little bit more skewed. Remember that in this particular case, 50% of our data falls right there. That's helpful for us to know. You're going to also notice that 1/4 of our data falls between those numbers. So we're starting to see some things that we have a larger spread between this value here and this value here than we had on this side. Remember that these represent 1/4 of our data, or in this case, I had 5, 7, and that led me to 12. And then if I go to my other side, I had 53, 42, and 36. And you're going to notice that these numbers are farther apart. And excuse the size of the pen here. Let me change that for my next part. Those ones are farther apart, and these ones are closer together. And you're going to see that in our box and whisker plot, that our whiskers are closer together. And that's going to be true for all 4 of those quartiles that we're looking at in this set of data. With that, I hope you have a little bit of information about both what our 5 number sets are and how to create and interpret box and whisker plots. Good luck.